Nice to be here. Yeah, happy birthday to Stone Club. It's a lovely thing. Lovely thing to be here. So I'm going to start. We're going to start kind of. Well, we're going to go in all kinds of places with this, but we're going to start down and we're going to kind of go up, I think. I've got a book that's coming out in 10 days' time, called Back to the Stone Age, and in it I explore why prehistory has become really kind of important in contemporary culture. Each age, you might say, has its own versions of the prehistoric, and so what I try and do is to show you what's characteristic of our own moment. What I call the prehistoric imagination, the ways in which prehistory sort of comes alive in the present, is a way we get insights into contemporary obsessions, contemporary anxieties, contemporary fantasies, and contemporary desires. So by kind of looking at prehistory, reading prehistory, we can learn quite a lot about the present. The broader context here is one that I don't think needs spelling out to people in this room. So global heating, the environmental catastrophe are encouraging us all to try and make sense of human life in a vastly expanded time frame. So evolutionary time, geological time become important ways of making sense of the human, to make sense of who we are as a species and how we are going to survive. So as those prehistoric beasts emerge rotting from the Siberian permafrost, and as Greta Thunberg reminds us that catastrophic climate change will, she says, most likely lead to the end of our civilization as we know it. This is great birthday material, isn't it? We are increasingly looking back to the distant past. The future looks bleak, and so we're looking back to get ideas about how to be happy, how to live in a healthy way, how to live sustainably. At a historical moment when it becomes easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, we are turning to the distant human past to explore those really big kind of existential questions about who we are, where we came from, and what we are like. So let me start with a really obvious example. And because we're at Stone Club, let's go lithic. So there has been, in recent years, a growing market for these Neolithic style barrow tombs. This is some kind of promotional material. So people get buried in these. They rent a niche for 1,000 years, I think, or is it £1,000? But anyway, people are getting buried in these. I think you can tell from the film, these are about an aesthetics of solidity. They are about architectural permanence. They are about being around for a very, very long time. And at risk of a cheap joke, the question is, well, who is getting buried in these? And of course the answer is boomers, right? It is an economically privileged generation, raised of course on the mysticism of prog rock, and somehow, even in their death, maintaining their kind of stranglehold, flaunting their status as mortgage-free property owners, laughing at an indebted Generation X, flaunting their status before renting millennials. And of course, that laughter is echoing through these lithic spaces for thousands and thousands of years. So, an example there, I think, of the way in which we can think about the prehistoric to learn something about the present, the current historical moment. Prehistory brings both kind of problems and opportunities, and the next example I'm going to use explores some of the contradictions, if you like, of prehistory's appeal. So we all love an open fire. I think there is a sense in which we are transported back to an earlier moment in human life. We think about who has been sat round fires for 200,000 years of human history. There's a sense in which, as we sit there watching the glowing embers, we watch the ash flying up into the night sky, we are transported back to an earlier moment, a primeval moment in human life. Seems to be something natural, something intrinsically human about this. On top of this, wood fires have strong environmental associations. So wood is theoretically sustainable because you can replant trees, and it is theoretically carbon neutral because it stores and releases atmospheric carbon. And this, so we're kind of doing good and we're feeling good at the same time. At least this is the vibe. And this explains, in my reading, a fashion in urban places for the installation of the domestic log burner, installed with increasing, you get a lot more of them after the global financial crisis of 2008. And in my reading, the log burner is channeling some prehistoric appeal. The log burner is not a cheaper way of heating your house. And so it's about the aesthetics of what's going on here. There's a sense in which the log burner appeals because it is not modern. It somehow harnesses that kind of primeval simplicity and transplants it into our domestic suburban lives. There's something simple about it. We know the supply chain. We don't need to worry about Gazprom because we know the wood can be sourced locally. There's something incredibly kind of homely about this. We feel that connection perhaps to a simpler primeval past. We imagine prehistoric peoples sat round socializing and looking at the embers as we do today. All of this, of course, has some quite perverse effects. Domestic wood burning, as some of you may know, is now the single largest source of ultrafine particulate pollution in the UK. It results, or it plays a part in increasing hospital admissions. It plays a part in increasing early deaths from respiratory diseases and cardiovascular diseases. These things chuck out something like 750 times the amount of ultrafine particulates as an HGV. These are really, really bad for us. And yet somehow our enthusiasm for the log burner is not diminished. And that is because, I would argue, of their symbolic value, that they facilitate a kind of prehistoric time travel. We are transported in our imagination, in our subconscious, as if to an earlier moment, a moment when the issue of pollution didn't exist, a moment before everything went wrong. It's almost as if the Clean Air Act of the mid-20th century doesn't apply here, because we are accessing this symbolic past that is somehow nested within our own historical present. And as long as the problems of air pollution are brought to life by traffic, by machines burning petrocarbons, the homely glow of the smouldering ember isn't on our radar. So the 21st century smogs that are created or part created by the log burner they evade our scrutiny and our concern. And of course, while in theory we all breathe the same air, the damage that is caused is uneven. So poor people, young people, old people, and black and brown people are all more likely to feel the adverse health outcomes associated with air pollution. people who install log burners remain predominantly middle class and predominantly white. Something like 97% of indoor wood burners are white people. And it's no coincidence then that the first time air pollution was recorded as a contributory cause of death was in respect of a 9-year-old black girl from South London. So the effects, if you like, of our fascination with prehistory are complex. Our forays into the distant past are not always innocent ones. We should remain critical of what prehistory is being used to legitimate. And I think that that's particularly the case in our Brexit moment. Here we have Jacob Rees-Mogg at the Stones of Stanton Drew, drawing on some very kind of long-standing narratives about who, if you like, belongs within the national space. The prehistoric landscape has, for a long time, been harnessed to some quite reactionary ideas. Conservative narratives of national identity and belonging, particularly, of course, around Stonehenge, which comes to stand as a symbol of the British nation. This is a promotional film for the British Army from 2017. This summer, our soon-to-be-dead Queen, her image is projected onto the sarcens of Stonehenge. Again, some quite exclusionary stories here about who belongs to the nation. This is the most kind of revealing image for me. So this is an image that is given to new citizens. And of course, Stonehenge, the Giants' Dance of Stonehenge, we have taking part in the Giants' Dance a white family, heterosexual, presumably white family. We've got a man, we've got a woman, we've got an old granny in the corner, and we got a child. As the mother's body merges with 23 tons of Neolithic sarsen, we're being told an unmistakable story here about continuity, about reproduction, about landscape and belonging. The question about who belongs to the British landscape is absolutely front and foremost here. My point, of course, is that nationalism is an attempt to capture, an attempt to annex something that is far older, that is far more ancient. It's an attempt to hold prehistory hostage. And we can think about this, in relation to the Queen image. We literally have the projection, those photons of light that describe the Queen there are a projection onto something far more venerable. And of course, there are vastly more ancient, vastly deeper ways of thinking about identity and belonging. And some of these are even worse. So this is Generation Identity, a far-right group who make claims about Aboriginal Britishness. So Generation Identity talk about preserving an ethno-cultural identity that has been in existence, they say, for something like 30,000 years. The far right have held rituals at places like Wayland Smithy and Avebury. And in a way, I think of these fuckers as like the evil Stone Club, right? Their version of prehistory is a racist one. It's an exclusionary one. And that's why I call this talk Prehistory for Antifascists. Not only to make the argument that Generation Identity and people like them are factually wrong, that they've got the wrong argument, they misunderstand what's happening, but that there are different ways of thinking about the prehistoric, different ways of thinking about community, identity, and belonging that can draw upon prehistory and use it in different kinds of ways. So if prehistory is a way of thinking outside of the terms of the present, we can think about an alternative politics to prehistory. The second rule of Stone Club is probably a good place to start here. Second rule of Stone Club, as you all know as paid up members, is that Stone Club is for everyone. And what I'm going to do in the second part of this talk is to now dismantle some of the misconceptions that we all have in our heads about the prehistoric. Probably a good time for a drink. Firstly, I think we can go to prehistoric specialists, we can talk to archaeologists, we can talk to paleogeneticists, we can talk to all kinds of people to revise some of our preconceptions about the prehistoric. So this, some of you will be familiar with. This is Cheddar Gorge, and it was here in 1903 that the bones of a skeleton that came to be known as Cheddar Man were found. And Cheddar Man was discovered to be, it turns out, some 10,000 years old. So Cheddar Man was here right at the end of the last ice age. And so this was the first kind of complete skeleton that was found, has been found so far, the oldest complete skeleton that's been found in the British Isles. Cheddar Man has been, and was for a number of years, drawn upon by those far-right ideologues to make those claims about Aboriginal Britishness. They said, Cheddar Man is one of our guys, he's a white boy, and that proves that we got here first and we own, we're in charge around here. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that a couple of years ago some genetic analysis was done on the bones of Cheddar Man, and he was revealed, like the Western European hunter-gatherer population that he is part of, he was revealed that he likely had what they called dark to black skin. This is slightly weird and not uncontroversial representation of Cheddar Man created by some Dutch mannequin makers as part of a Channel 4 documentary that was called The First Brit. And there is some quite delicious irony here that the first Brit, the person that was held up to be the Aboriginal Briton, ends up being a person of colour. This was no great revelation to prehistoric specialists, but I think it goes to show how deeply embedded are those ideas about white people having some kind of primordial claim to belonging in Britain. Prehistoric specialists can give us all kinds of ways of kind of rethinking what were historically presented as wars, as violent conflicts, thinking about those more in terms of interaction and exchange that have taken place maybe over tens, maybe hundreds of years. There's some examples from history, so some recent genetics on Anglo-Saxon genetic work has shown that West African ancestry is evident not just in one kind of single isolated case, but in a number of different cases. So Anglo-Saxon England had relations with West Africa. Both history and prehistory are more complex than we have led ourselves to believe. But I want to make the argument tonight that it's important to think beyond the evidence of archaeology, beyond scientific proof. Essentially, in our heads, we have a bunch of fantasies about prehistoric life and prehistoric peoples. Our self-image as modern depends upon so much that is unknown and unknowable, and will remain forever unknown and unknowable. And yet we very readily project some very conservative and some very reactionary views onto the distant human past. So take the example of prehistoric gender relations. The dominant narratives that we have were formed in Victorian society, and they just so happen to resemble the sexual division of labour that existed in Victorian society. So ideas of men as hunter, woman as gatherer, binaries of the active and the passive. Now, we tell ourselves now that times have changed, that this is no longer how we think. But sometimes we act as if our feminism is an artifact of civilization, as if it is something we have invented to protect ourselves from the truth of what human beings are like underneath it all. It's almost as if we can operate with this idea that an unreconstructed caveman lurks underneath, is somehow kind of what we are really like. But it would be wrong to give an account of patriarchy as an account of human nature. So human beings have been around for something like 200,000 years, and during that time they've had opportunities to organize themselves into patriarchal societies, sure, into matriarchal societies, into egalitarian societies, as well as to do sex and gender in ways that are not remotely on our agenda today. So if prehistory becomes a way of thinking outside of the present, it can give us a way of thinking outside of not only, say, 500 years of capitalism and imperialism and colonialism. It can give us a way of thinking outside of 5,000 years of patriarchy. These become not essential to the human condition, part of who we are, but they become contingent, they become contestable, they become subject to change. A really kind of favourite example of the way in which people are wedded, if you like, to stereotypes of prehistory is the example of haircuts. So this is some of the first figurative art, these figurines from about 25,000 years ago. And what is distinctive about them all is that they all have some kind of a haircut. There's some kind of distinctive styling of hair to the head. There's a lack of facial hair and body hair, but they all have haircuts of some kind or another. And yet, in our heads, when we imagine a prehistoric person, this guy is still lurking. I checked, so I asked AI to draw me a prehistoric person. I thought, I'm going to, do my research, and I'm going to make sure that this is true. And it drew me these guys. And we can say lots and lots about these images, but one thing I think we can agree is that they've all got really shit hair. Yeah. Actually, I asked AA to draw me a prehistoric person with neat hair, but it couldn't do it, right? Because actually, in the way that it understood prehistory, shit hair was part of the deal. Why is this? Oh, and of course, Cheddar Man, poor love. I mean, I love Cheddar Man, right? But even in the Cheddar Man reconstruction, he's got a really bad razor cut fringe and an awful mullet. And so even Cheddar Man has really bad hair. So my question is, why is this? The answer, of course, is that prehistoric people are not us. We think of them as not us. We are policing that symbolic boundary between now and then. We are holding on to some conception of difference. And what we need to do, I think, is to let go of that. What if we actively challenged that incorrect conception of the prehistoric? What if we imagine cave people with a nice quiff, for example, wearing box braids or with a cute bob with a neat fringe? We can, I suggest, imagine prehistory differently. So if much of prehistory is unknown and unknowable, will remain forever unknown and unknowable, then we don't need to fill this imaginative void with shit hair, with racism, with sexism, and reinforce those as a kind of essential attributes of human nature. We don't need to hand over our imagination of prehistory to the racists and the fascists and the incels, who will say that their self-serving myths are the way that things were and the way that things should be, because they are what we are like as human beings. There is a massive potential to think about the prehistoric differently, to ground different kinds of future. And I think, Stone Club is a great example of that. Stone Club in dialogue, creative dialogue with folk traditions, with art cultures, giving us a way of rethinking the everyday. So our kind of muddy walk to a monolith can be a way of re-engaging the prehistoric to serve a different set of ideas. There are loads of amazing precedents here. So here are the Kilo Kift, who were knocking about 100 years ago. You'll note sporting those cute bobs with their neat fringes. The Kilo Kift were an explicitly internationalist and anti-racist organisation. They went around conducting what they called their weird rites, and doing so to rework what prehistory meant, to think about the prehistoric in a new kind of way. The cultural geographer Doreen Massey, this is Skiddaw, by the way, in the Lake District. Doreen Massey writes about Skiddaw and what she calls the immigrant rocks that make it up. So Skiddaw, Massey tells the story about Skiddaw that was formed, the rocks here were formed some 500 million years ago, about a third of the way south of the equator towards the South Pole. Massey kind of gets us thinking about deep time, geological time, to rethink the apparent permanence of the landscape. So we can ask really kind of interesting questions about who belongs to the land when the rocks that form it have themselves their own migrant histories. I'm suggesting we can open up prehistory to some quite radical ideas. Prehistory can be rethought in ways that serve anti-racist agendas. We can think of prehistory as decolonial. We can think of prehistory as multicultural. We can think of prehistory as post-binary, as feminist, as gender queer. And here, I think it's important to recognize we are not anachronistically imposing some definition, some kind of contemporary onto the distant human past. What we're doing is what human beings have always done, which is to engage in a creative dialogue with that shared human past, where what we are as human beings is not singular, is not fixed, is not set in stone. Prehistory can provide some imaginative foundations for a better future. And I'm going to end with the feminist artist Marie Beth Adelson, who imagines, as part of her series Death of the Patriarchy, she imagines some sidewalk graffiti. So she's walking along the road, and scrawled upon the wall, Marie Beth Adelson writes, "Your 500 years are up." That's it. I'm done. Thank you. Let me just say, I've got a book launch. If anybody wants to come along in January, you're all very welcome. There's an Eventbrite, so you can Google it. Yeah, I've got a few copies for sale, so if you want to come and see me, I can sell you a copy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, we've got Richard Norris